Welcome to the Vinimark podcast, a collection of interviews with thought leaders of the wine world, brought to you by Vinimark.
It didn't appear as if Perold had a great attention span, you know. What's the stuff the kids take?
Ritalin, yeah.
Ritalin hadn't been invented yet. There's a lot of technical stuff about Pinotage. It's a hell of a quick fermenter. It's very volatile. They probably never had to deal with this animal before. It's like a cat owner suddenly having a Bengal cat, you know. It's a new species. The first farm to actually produce Pinotage from its own grapes and bottle it on the farm was Dalheim. Definitely no new oak in those days. Even the George Spices of 1966 GS Cabernet only matured in stainless steel.
That was the voice of Emile Joubert, who's arguably one of the most fascinating historians in the South African winelands. He's been operating for over 30 years and has access to some of the most inspiring and formidable voices in South African wine. Today, we are going to tap into his memory palace to discuss the often less talked about elements of Pinotage's history in South Africa. Good morning, Emile, and thank you so much for taking time to join us today. I'm been very excited to unravel a full century of Pinotage, mostly because the mists of time have sometimes obscured what actually happened. And
Morning, John.
Before we start on Pinotage, I wanted to ask you, how would you describe yourself in the wine industry?
I ask myself that question every day. So thank you for giving me the opportunity once again to go down that route. Formally, I'm a reputation and brand manager for various Cape wine cellars, and I am also a wine writer. I never set out to be a wine professional. I started my career as a journalist at the Afrikaans newspapers called Die Burger, and then I morphed into public relations communications, doing PR for all kinds of clients. But I had one or two wine clients, and this professional bridge through PR had allowed me to enter the industry, which I did about 25 years ago. And since then, I've been writing, communicating, interacting with influential wine personalities like yourself on behalf of my brands.
This may seem like a really silly question to a South African wine lover, but given that we have a number of international listeners, I want to ask about Pinotage at the very basic level. Can you explain from a third grade perspective, what is Pinotage, how did it come about, and can you give the reason for its name?
Pinotage is known worldwide as South Africa's homegrown grape variety, one of many, but the difference with Pinotage being that it was actually established and gained commercial traction in the South African wine industry. It is a crossing between two grape varieties, one being Cinsault, or as it was known early in the Cape, Hermitage, and the other being the more familiar and the more noble variety called Pinot Noir. So can I call it a human invention without it making sound like a Frankenstein? And the chap behind this was a guy called Abraham Perold, who was really a total genius in the sense of his lifelong dedication, commitment to grape varieties, wine grapes and table grapes. He was trained at Geisenheim in Germany. He spoke 5 or 6 languages. He died in the late 40s, so his glory days were about 1915 through to about 1942, 43. That was Perold's glory era. Anyway, he was just a brilliant scientist, and I've read books on him. I've read articles by him, and he had this unquenchable thirst to establish, first of all, new varieties or variations thereof, wine grapes and table grapes in South Africa, and to create a real landscape of vineyards excellence in South Africa. Now, in Perold's day, talking about the beginning of the 1900s, South Africa was awash with varieties, Semillon, Chenin Blanc, Cinsault, and we were basically making copious amounts of wine for distillation purposes and for entry-level everyday drinking. There were a couple of brands out there, but the majority of the farmers were just planting stuff and making wine for the bigger cooperatives like Stellenbosch Farmers Winery, the KWV, Distillers Corporation, and so forth. In any event, Perold was the first head of oenology and viticulture at the University of Stellenbosch. That was started in 1917, and he was based in Welgevallen, which is just kind of south of Kutsenberg, Dani Craven Rugby Stadium. And there he did a lot of his experiments in grape varieties. He brought in a lot of plantings from overseas all the time. Long before Dani de Wet and these guys were tagged for smuggling in grapes, Perold had Grenache Noir and Ga and Arcelevolu and you name it. He grew these things and he played around.
Sure.
He just played. On the one hand, very conservative person, very formal, great academic, followed all the rules. But I think when the sun set and he had 2-3 glasses of wine, he became like a nutty professor experimenting. And he was obsessed with Pinot Noir. But being an economic realist, he realized that Pinot Noir, being a shy grower, is never really going, in terms of yields, is never really going to be viable in South Africa at that stage. He loved fine wines. He spoke about making Chardonnay long before we'd smuggled in Chardonnay. He was a great proponent of Sauvignon Blanc. He got Cabernet Sauvignon set into the Stellenbosch winelands into Paul. So he realized fine wine, but he also realized that the farmers had to have a high enough yield to make it economically viable. So looking at Pinot Noir by its little buried bunch self, he said, how can I bulk up this creature? And what variety can I use to bulk it up with if I made a crossing? And he chose Cinsault. Quite interesting why he chose Cinsault. I mean, it could have been perhaps something like Grenache. He could have used possibly, which would have made, I think you and I could agree, could have made a very excellent combination. But anyway, he chose Cinsault. Cinsault is thin-skinned, big berry, a lot of juice, a lot of flesh. So he thought if he could get that noble elegance of Pinot Noir and he could flab it out a little bit with the juice and the muscle and the belly of Cinsault, he'd have something which gives us classy wine, but we can grow it at a great yield, 20, 30 tons a hectare, and all the farmers would make enough money from it, they'd be happy. So that was his experiment. Now, I'm not a botanist, Jono, so you have to bear with me. But basically, when you cross two varieties, you take the pollen of one, and you have to zip it into the flowering bud of the other variety. So I believe that he took Pinot Noir pollen, and which he then put onto a Cinsault flower. And with that, you get a little grape growing out of it, and you get seedlings, the holy grail of seedlings. So you've got the seedling of this new variety, and from that seedling, you can grow little plants, and you can make a little vineyard, and you can start a wine industry. So the crossing was done in 1924, and in 1925, from the harvest of 1925, he got his little grape, new unnamed hybrid grape, of which he took the seedlings and he made little flower plants out of them, and he made a little vineyard. And the interesting thing about all this, it didn't appear as if Perold had a great attention span, What's the stuff the kids take?
Ritalin, yeah.
Yeah, Ritalin hadn't been invented yet. So, but apparently he just moved on because he planted a couple of Pinotage vines, but then just went on with other stuff. And in 1927, he planted those vines in 1920, all the beginnings of those vines in 1925, 26. 1927, he was transferred to the KWV to become head honcho of the KWV. And so he left everything at Welgevallen and then just buggered off to the KWV because he became the head production winemaking oak at the KWV. Now, my theory would have it, if this was such a valuable, treasured, insightful, revolutionary, pioneering experiment of crossing Cinsault and Pinot Noir to form a new grape variety, he would have kind of cherished those vineyards, wouldn't you think?
Would,
don't you think he'd but he didn't. He just cruised over to Paul, and he was up to a guy called Charlie Niehaus, who was a student of Perold and also a winemaker at the KWV. He actually rescued those vines together in Perold's garden in Welgevallen, together with Professor Chris de Tooy, who followed up Perold as head of viticulture and enology at Stellenbosch. And so not Chris de Tooy, Chris Tron. And so Chris Tron and Charlie Niehaus kind of saved the Pinotage. A couple of sticks, vines, whatever were left. I think the number of 4 is being bandied about. Those were taken to Elsenburg. And then they were, it's a long-term process, this, Jono. So those vines were planted and propagated at Elsenburg. And then in 1941, Pinotage was made at Elsenburg by a guy called C.T. de Waal, family of the de Waals from Uiterwyk. He kind of made the first, I think, half a barrel or a barrel of Pinotage. And, they're just lying there. And the KWV also made some Pinotage in the late 40s, experimental stuff. So it was, for a long time, it was pretty much an experiment. this wine that came out of this once-in-a-lifetime initial. And as I said, I could find no real talk of Perold freaking out about this new grape variety. It's success. We must now plant it. This is the next stage of where South Africa is going. It was just like deemed as a work in progress. I didn't know what else Perold and other guys are busy with crossing at the time and experimenting with. But Pinotage was there, I suppose, with a lot of other newish kind of varieties or unknown varieties lying in barrel. But now the interesting thing is that what led to Pinotage making its mark on the landscape was a bit of an old boys club, actually, because when Perold was lecturing at university, some of his students were Paul Sauer, who owned Kanonkop Wine Farm, who inherited Kanonkop in 1919. One of the students was P.K. Morkel from Bellevue Wine Farm. So they had all been students of Perold in viticulture and viniculture, and they were all rugby players. So do you see a kind of old boys club developing here? Bellevue and Kanonkop, together with Uiterwyk, where C.T. de Waal was, were the first farms to actually go out and plant Pinotage. Now, to me, that is where things really get interesting for somebody who looks at the human factor and it's in the wine industry, because these guys went out. There was no market for Pinotage. There were 2 or 3 barrels in existence. Nobody knew of Pinotage. Yet they were investing in propagating and planting vines on their valuable Stellenbosch real estate of Stellenbosch Kloof and Simonsburg and Bottlerij, where Bellevue is. They were willing to take a chance and plant the bloody thing there, which, I mean, is how kind of, it's like a crusade.
Yeah.
Which wine farmer today would plant a grape variety for which there is no market to begin with? And the second thing is nobody had a clue what it was. Yet they planted Pinotage. And there was also a lot of Pinotage planted out in Franschhoek, Bemmershoek area. And by the late 60s, we had about 127,000 hectares of vines. Pinotage was already 2% of the South African vineyard, already quite a bit. So what they were doing with it for the first couple of years, I don't know. It was probably going to Farmers Winery and the KWV for blending wine for distilling purposes. What changed the whole scenario, though, was in 1959, when the first commercial Pinotage was bottled. And the vision behind that came from the corporation Stellenbosch Farmers Winery. You're talking 1959. Stellenbosch was producing perhaps 7 or 8 wines made by wine farms, made on the wine estates, if that. I mean, those days, 99.9% of the farmers were delivering their grapes and their juice to the big corporates from which brands were made, like Chateau Libertas, Oude Libertas, Lieberstein, Grünbergerstein, all that. We didn't have an estate wine culture. So it was up to the big corporates to take the decision of which wines to make under which labels. The Stellenbosch Farmers Winery had a brand called Landsrack. Now, this is where the confusion comes in. A lot of people reckon that the first Pinotage labeled 1959, commercially released in 1961, bears the name Landsrack. The misconception is that was made at the Landsrack wine farm, which we know today, the wine estate of Landsrack. Not the case. Landsrack was just a label and a brand owned by Stellenbosch Farmers Winery.
But can I quickly interrupt there? Was the brand Landsrack inspired by the existing estate? Because I know that in 1958, Landsrack, the estate, got bought and they destroyed the cellar, not destroyed it, but completely repurposed it into hotel lounges and restaurants. So can we assume at least that the inspiration for the marketing brand that Stellenbosch Farmers Winery owned came from the estate of Landsrack?
Probably. What those guys did was in the 50s, like Stellenbosch Farmers Winery and distillers, they would have a hell of a big marketing department, and they'd find cute names and they'd register them so that when a wine came along who could fit the cute name, they'd bottle it under that cute name. Zonnebloem, Chateau Libertas, Oude Libertas, Tassenberg, the Fleur de Cap in the case of distillers. Those were places, but they weren't making wine. They were just cute names of places.
Sure.
The Landsrack was a lekker name, and they thought that when it came to bottling Pinotage, let's do it under that label. So Stellenbosch Farmers Winery released the first Pinotage in 1961 from a vintage 1959, and the source of that Pinotage was Bellevue Estate in Bottleray. Pierre Carl Morkel, who I just mentioned, that was the Pinotage from that farm, went into the Landsrack 1959. Later, vintages of Landsrack also had grapes from Kanonkop, amongst others, in it. And you know yourself, what do we like in the wine industry? We like something new with a story behind it. So when Pinotage started hitting the streets, people saw it on the bottle store shelves and in the restaurants. And number one, it's a new variety, the red grape. And what's more, it's unique to South Africa. From the word go, there was a pretty strong commercial uptake.
So the story that is told generally is 1959 vintages bottled. In 1961, we know that there was no new oak being used then. So what was it being matured in for 2 years?
Definitely no new oak in those days. It'll be those big food rare, or even in any container you could find, a stainless steel tank. I mean, even the George Spices of 1966 GS Cabernet, famous wine, was only matured in stainless steel, and the 68 was into large, innocuous food rare, which would have no effect on the wine at all. I think it could probably have been released after a year, but they were still buggering around with the label and the bottle shape and all that. And there's guys just saying, hey, just keep it cool and just keep it somewhere. I mean, those days, a lot of those wines were bottled, those red wines were bottled after 5 or 6 months. I've had Eau de Libertas Cinsault from the late 60s, early 70s, which is fantastic, absolutely gorgeous wines, tasted really like old Pinot Noir. And I spoke to the late Davey Bailey. He said it was all stainless steel tanks. But it's just an interesting aside, the first farm to actually produce Pinotage from its own grapes, make it on the farm and bottle it on the farm, was Dalheim in 1960 by Sparling. Who had a great love of Pinotage. The vines were actually planted in the 40s by Hoheisen, who was Spat's family member of his, who bought Spat's out from Germany, actually. That 1960 label of Dalheim is Pinotage, and it's got the words Burgundy style on the label, alluding to the fact that it's a lighter styled wine. But I've had that old 1959 Landsrack Pinotage, and damn fine wine.
That's a lovely little piece of trivia that no one's ever going to get the answer right to, is the first estate bottling of Pinotage was from Dalheim. But to explain to me the difference in the sense that the Landsrack labeled 1959 vintage, all the fruit came from one estate, but it technically wasn't an estate wine. It wasn't a landgoed wine. Is that correct?
The wine belonged to somebody else. Belonged to Farmers Winery. That's the bottom line. Dalheim belonged to Spat Sparling at Dalheim. And the wine from Bellevue, they could have bottled it themselves if they wanted to, if that was part of their game plan. But obviously in those days, it wasn't the done thing. People didn't know enough about the wine industry. They didn't have enough access to marketing or distribution. So many of the farms just said, well, let's just, even Kanonkop up until 1973 was selling all its grapes to farmers, making all its wine and selling it to farmers' winery to gain into brands they had no control over. And Bellevue's Pinotage was made in the Bellevue cellar. The wine bought by SFW and bottled under the Landsrack label, and then legend is born. And here we are today, Chuf Pinotage, one of South Africa's major grape varieties. And for some of the reason, it keeps itself going by tending to attract a large amount of debate and discussion.
It's surely got more than just controversy to its name to keep it going. By 1961, you said it was 2% of the national vineyard, and it did keep selling in the market. So it wasn't, as the story is told, that it won some big award in 1961 and then was planted like wildfire. It already existed in the market and the consumer had spoken and supported it. Is that right?
It was part of the viticultural landscape, but the majority of the grapes were being used in blends, with these large innocuous blends, probably even ones like Rudeberg and so on. would or might have contained some Pinotage or any sort of dry red. I think it was just ticking along, and the wine makers at SFW and KWV and distillers were just checking out how the stuff is going,
Yeah.
Perhaps because, there's a lot of technical stuff about Pinotage. It's a hell of a quick fermenter. It's very volatile. They probably never had to deal with this animal before.
Sure.
It's like a cat owner suddenly having a Bengal cat, it's a new species. I've got to check this thing out before I'm ready to really take to it. So they're probably hanging around from the mid-40s to 1959 before making that call to bottle it as a single variety.
If we could spend just a little more time in the 1940s, because you made this point, you said there was a bit of an old boys club, and you said C.T. Duval was actually making Pinotage even though it wasn't in the market. And then Paul Sauer at Kanonko planted it, and Bellevue planted it. And you said those were all Perold students, which, at a surface level, you go, okay, well, then obviously they were all doing it out of courtesy to Perold. But Charlie Niehaus was also a student of Perold. So it would seem like Niehaus was actually the driving force behind the proliferation.
His name doesn't come up a lot in the Pinotage context in this book of Perold, except for when he helped Chris Tron save those couple of vines. But then the other big players was Berendal. They were also planting it way back when. Okay. And they were also part of the KWV, I think. So the things being delivered. But I really think, but John, this is the thing about wine. People don't want to do the same thing decade and decade. So everybody's planting Cinsault and Chenin Blanc and Simeon and here's something new. And perhaps the attachment with Perold wasn't like personal. They thought, hey man, we've got a South African heritage and legacy, and let's try and make something of it. So to me, it's really very visionary, and I don't think the industry gives itself enough credit for that. I mean, which other variety in the world, which is a crossing or new variety, has gained the international traction and become as part of the international wine conversation as Pinotage from little old South Africa has? I can't think of one.
But I think that's exactly why it's such an important story to tell. But there's still a lot of chapters. I mean, obviously, we all talk about the 1991 award with Beyers Trutte as this watershed moment. But it still had 2-3 decades to get through before it could get to that moment.
But you youngsters must remember one thing, John. The 70s and the 80s, you're talking about the S word called sanctions, economic sanctions. So we were bloody nowhere in that time. 100% of all the Pinotage up until then was consumed in South Africa. So the period you're talking about, the 60s, 70s, 80s, Pinotage was lekker, it was South Africa. And fortunately, there was the demand for red wine really increased from the 70s onwards as the national palate changed, because up until the 60s, semi-sweet white wine and fortified wine was de rigueur. That's what the country wanted. 70s developed an appetite for red wine. There was a red wine shortage at one stage, and Pinotage was part of that. So the fact that we had healthy consumption levels locally obviously spurred on the industry to plant more and expand it. And then when we came out of the sanctions era, and we suddenly got new technologies, and we started getting exposure for our wines. We learned more about ourselves from the viewpoints of others, started traveling to other parts of the world. We really started thinking about Pinotage in terms of staking it as a South African wine, and then looking at what it can offer in terms of its character and its personality, and what it can mean to the South African wine industry. And as you rightly said when we were at Michael Fridjon's feedback session at the Trophy Wine Show, it's just incredible to think that made in 61, so that's 64 years ago, and is such an infant. We haven't begun to scratch the surface of Pinotage yet as a grape variety, and that I find immensely exciting. And that's why I trial and test Pinotages and see where it's going. I've even made it myself, by the way, which didn't go too well. It's a bit of an animal. It's like a thing ferments, and it picks up a lot of heat when it's fermenting. So I was making a bin. It was like, I think 700 kilograms of Pinotage at Stellenbosch Hills. When the Garage East vibe started becoming popular in the early 2000s, I jumped on board. I wanted to make this Pinotage. But yes, it's like a animal, I can see why some winemakers tend to treat it with kid gloves.
It seems that Perold wanted some of the Pinot Noir style, but he wanted Cinsault's yield and fruit. I'm just wondering, how on earth did this grape get to be a massively inky, violent fermenter that has quite rich color, which it gives up very quickly, and huge tannins, which it gives up very quickly? That doesn't seem like a logical offspring from Pinot Noir and Cinsault. Was it like that from the beginning, or have there been decisions made in the propagation of Pinot Noir that has seen it change its character either through massal selection or through deliberate kind of clonal engineering?
Well, look, you can never determine your offspring, Jono. You can be the most staid, morally obligated, conservative, well-mannered mother and father, and then you can have a real rough child coming out of you. But first, I want to get back to styles.
Yeah.
I'm of the opinion that it's not up to any commentator to determine a wine style for a winemaker. I have a great gripe with these commentators who say, yeah, but we should be making this wine in a more bloody left bank style, or we should making our own wines less Australian and more French. I mean, that's a lot of nonsense. It's up to the winemaker, because what the winemaker is, he's custodian of his vineyards, who he lives with every day through all their cycles, all their moods, all their seasons. He harvests the grapes. He sees what he gets from that vineyard, and it's up to him to interpret that offering of nature to best reflect that terroir, as well as the want of his owner's soul and vision. So it's not up to you and me to say less wood, more wood, no malolactic, yes malolactic, whatever. It comes from within. So somebody who makes a 15.5% Pinotage, 3 years in new green oak, and she feels the best way to go about it, absolutely fine. But as being said with Pinotage, I think that if I was a winemaker, I would be very excited about what Pinotage has to offer, because, as you quite rightly say, it has proven itself to work in different environments. These sort of so-called well-wooded blockbuster Pinotages from the classic producers, that works. It has a certain audience. Other people think differently. They are more interested in the cooler, the lighter, the refinement. They find that in Pinotage. They see it in Pinotage, and they use it. It has so much to offer a winemaker that the future of Pinotage, coming from the solid foundation, this pioneering, visionary, almost obstreperous South African vision of the grape, it's just the most exciting thing around at the moment, because I can say some of the best wines, South African wines I've had, some of the best wines in the world I've had are Pinotage. Some of the worst I've had, also Pinotages. We had Tom Carson, who was here for the Trophy Wine Show. He had the expression of allowing winemakers to have a go. And I think that's where we are with Pinotage. We're getting some fantastic winemakers out there who really have come to Pinotage with a clean slate and a sense of adventure, and they make a fantastic, lighter, briskier style of Pinotage, which the grape lends it to fantastically. Some other oaks, through the third or fourth generation of winemakers, their grandfather said, we're making Pinotage that way, and I'm going to bliksem you if you ever veer off the course. Grandson follows those lines. He makes great wine. So I think we shouldn't allow any hoodwinks in terms of expressing a certain variety in South Africa. And Pinotage will evolve, and it'll stay the same. Burgundy. If you taste it, I've had some Burgundies from the 30s and 40s, and those wines are so different. Obviously, they're older, but you can sense that they were made in a bigger, more concentrated, tougher way than they are today. So it happens all over the wine industry. It's happening in Bordeaux. The Bordeauxs you're tasting today, okay, people blame climate change. I don't think it's correct to blame climate change, but the wooding regimes have changed, the pH regimes have changed, and making more concentrated wines. It's a natural thing about wine. And if this constant evolution And this constant positive questioning and the sense of having a go in the cellar didn't exist. I'd much rather be doing public relations for one of the beer companies or the gin companies where everything stays the same.
So then, can I ask you, let's say there are people listening who perhaps say, no, I've tasted Pinotage and it tastes of burnt rubber and bananas and nail varnish. What was going wrong with those wines when we first kind of came back into the international market in the early 90s? And how has that changed? Why has quality improved? What did we do to fix that problem?
Regarding those journalists who were out there which made those comments that have irked the Pinotage Association for decades, they can't seem to pray it away. It still hangs over them like a mottled purple cloud. One was also just put the whole wine world into context. In the 90s, wine became global. This wasn't only South Africa being opened up, but the Australians were really, in the 80s, the Australians only started making a big play, the European and American markets, as did New Zealand. So I think if you look at a graph of wine consumption outside of Europe, you look at from the 80s onwards, there's interest in wine globally. And the British journalists who came out here and made these comments, if you'd been weaned on Burgundies and good claret and brilliant, fruity, bright, clean Australian Shiraz they're making at the time, still do today. And suddenly you came to South Africa and you find this other beast. I think the comments were were amplified to a certain extent. I think that it was just because it was different. It's like getting a hollandaise sauce suddenly with a bit of truffle in it. It's just it just shivers you, and you're not used to it. So I think there was a bit of overreaction as far as that's concerned, because there are certain factors in Pinotage that are different to what you're normally used to wine. But just because you're not used to them doesn't mean you have to make monstrously negative remarks about that. So I think that it's like a knee-jerk instinct initially, and I think the fact that we're still talking about it 40 years later, 35, 40 years later, that's something we should just forget about totally. I think they said the same thing about, great writers said the same thing about South African Chardonnay, and they also whacked Cabernet Sauvignon, you name it. So we've been through that. The thing about Pinotage, and I know which Pinotages you're talking about in a less than positive sense, and the winemakers I've spoken to, I've spoken about that fact of the fermentation and the volatility of the grape, and the fact that it can grasp onto irregular tannins in a way few other varieties can. So I remember speaking to Charles Back a couple of years ago about Pinotage, and he said the first thing for him is pips, to get rid of them. The pips must be ripe, and you got to get rid of them as quickly as possible before you ferment even, because that causes a lot of volatility. And that seems to be the case with some of the skins as well. So I think for a long time, winemakers were treating Pinotage the same way they were making Cabernet and Shiraz. And because what other frame of reference did you have?
No,
the same thing with a lot of guys who started out making Pinot Noir. The only reference you had was, unless you'd been schooled in Burgundy or someplace, the only reference you had were other red grapes. So you try to make them as you would make a Cabernet. So same with wood. We didn't know how to use wood 30, 40 years ago. We've learned it. So it's a very learning curve. But I would definitely think that the Pinotage producers I've been speaking to, the fact of cooler ferments definitely is a factor, ensuring the pips are ripe. And then, of course, the use of wood. Some Pinotages are fantastic in older wood. Pinotages also work well with amphora, but new wood is brilliant because it sucks in a lot of the dry acerbic coatings in the wine and concentrates it, that the plusher, sweeter side of it comes out. So I don't think there's a combination between the technical side of the ferments. That's why you find a lot of young winemakers like Wolf and Women, for example, would use cooler ferments but keep the skins on the grapes longer, whereas other players still go for broke and they allow it to ferment for the 3 or 4 days until it's dry and haul it off. But then they've got a wood regime which is schooled and managed to give them the wine they want. I definitely think it's a fact of your understanding of the raw material. But I definitely think the people are starting to really understand Pinotage, and they're taking it up as a challenge. Yes, I want to see purity. I'm looking for greater purity and less concentration. I've got this fruit, and this is how I see it. now, and I've got an idea of how I want in the future, and these are the technicalities. I think what's been the greatest contribution to quality Pinotage is the thinking behind it. I think it's a grape, and with due respect, perhaps the producers, when they're making 4 or 5 red varieties, the Pinotage draws out a bit more thinking and a bit more diligence than the other varieties. This is from a gringo's viewpoint. But I definitely think that the main thing is understanding your state of ripeness of your grapes, not affording any greenness. Pyrozine's a no-no. My friend tastes low at Dimmersdal. He wants no pyrozine, Kanonkop as well. So they clean out all their shoots that can cause the slightest bit of shade on the grapes, giving them pyrozine. So a lot of work in the vineyards has led to where we are today, and also thinking about the wine in the winery.
So I want to get your opinion on a winemaking trend that's happening currently. What winemakers are doing is they ferment a little bit cooler, but then they also remove the fermenting juice from the skins when there's at least 30% fermentation still to go. So they're fermenting for the last third, essentially like a white wine with no skins present. And as far as they're concerned, this better reflects the natural heritage of the grape. From a philosophical perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think we can talk about a grape reflecting a philosophy, because the variety...
Are you a real journalist? Come on.
Then those guys were studying enology and philosophy and voodoo at the same time. Okay. But the grape doesn't have a philosophy. But the person who makes it has a philosophy. But I really like that way of thinking. And that's what I said at the beginning. It's all the vision of the winemaker and what they want to express from it. That's their way of thinking. It's not the grape variety's way of thinking. And if that comes from a specific terroir, which is giving them a stage of phenolic ripeness, it's giving them acidity and pH levels and sugar to a certain degree, and they feel it warranted, absolutely. Why not? I had the most fantastic Pinot Noir from America the other day, from California, with Paul Kluwer. And it was a white wine. I kid you not. He poured this to a bunch of sommeliers, and we were all thinking, it's got a bit of a Chardonnay tinge, but when nobody got it right, it was 100% Pinot Noir. It was a white wine. And it wasn't a gimmick. But so, okay, that's perhaps too extreme. But what you're saying now is, and go to my point of skins and pips, it's a burning engine during fermentation. So if you can cool it down, and you can find another way to get around it, yet you still get the same color, or you get enough color. It doesn't have to be deep black ink. Get enough color, then I'm absolutely all for it. I'm glad it's happening. I'm glad people are taking up the bundle. I mean, Eben's making Pinotage now, Eben, which is fantastic. In his own inimitable style. Many other producers, young producers, have taken on to Pinotage and are taking it forward. And I think the variety is just in an excellent space. I do think, though, that it should be, I don't want to cause any offense here, but, the Pinotage Association is pretty much, I'm Afrikaans, I'm old school, but I'm not that Afrikaans and that old school. I think that this whole philosophy of Pinotage being God's gift to South Africa, and it's part of our DNA, and I'll die for Pinotage. I mean, you go to a Pinotage top 10 competition these days, it's like a bloody seance. The preacher graced before the meals, showing us his Pinotage T-shirt, for God's sake. This is nonsense. I think the Pinotage narrative needs to be broadened. We have to get more exciting voices involved in Pinotage. If you can do that, you'd be most welcome. And the association of thinking behind Pinotage is still too much old school and clogged in the past. I think the communication must be broader, lighter, more welcoming, open. And I'm talking as not a conservative, but as an old school Afrikaner here. I'm dying to see more. That's why when Eben started making Pinotage, I was like, wow, fantastic. I thought, Johnny Fever wants to talk about Pinotage. Hey, we need more of this kind of thing.
Can you be specific? What do you think we need to be talking more about? Where do you see a dearth of solid information?
Okay. First of all, getting more producers involved, Jono. And I know a lot of the kind of hip young producers have been contacted by the association to bring them in, but they don't want to get involved with the association for some other reason. But I need that stuff. You talking about the winemakers taking the wine off the skins to hold back on the ferment and the extract. That's great news. I think younger Pinotage producers should be lauded and put forward. I think we should have more interaction with group tastings for media and sommeliers and voices in the industry, opening it up. I think it's been confined, and I love Bayer Street to death. I mean, he's a mentor. But you reach a time where you should, just let other oaks move on and take up the baton and move forward and get a younger generation involved and let their way of thinking contribute. Hand over the flame, because the flame is only going to burn stronger and brighter once it's been handed over. I'm talking as somebody who keeps an eye on the media, and there's no excitement around Pinotage, as there is with Chardonnay. What a brilliant example. I mean, and because why? They have these open-minded champions behind it. Chenin Blanc as well. In Afrikaans, we have this saying of it must get out of its borstrock. And a borstrock is those well-bone corsets the women used to wear in the Victorian times. You must just open up a bit more. And I don't see that happening in Pinotage, unfortunately. It's too much boerewors braaiing and boeremusiek, and that's the image of Pinotage. And that's cute, and it's okay to assert it for a couple of decades, but then you really have to move on. I want to see brighter personalities talking about the grape variety. I want brand owners to promote their wines in a unique South African way, put a bit of vibe behind it. And to celebrate the quality, to celebrate when it works on a Pinotage on the world stage, for example. Really look into that. If it gets a gold medal at one of these overseas competitions, I'm not a great fan of wine competitions, but I mean, it's important if international judges rate your wine. Get them to comment on it. Have something with Jancis Robinson and Andrew Jefford. Just become part of the greater wine conversation, part of the greater global context, because I think as far as that goes, Pinotage is being left behind, and the bulk of the information is about Pinotage as a curiosity instead of it being a bit of, I would call it a vinous miracle, seeing the story behind it and looking at where it's come today.
You used Chardonnay as an example because there is a definite excitement all of a sudden around South African Chardonnay, but that seems to have arisen out of the fact that for the last 3 years at least, we've had a number of international critics. It was Neil Martin, it was Tim Atkin, it was the international panel from the Michael Friedgen Trophy Wine Show, not just 1 year, but 2, possibly 3 years in a row, highlighting the quality of Chardonnay. So it seems like that excitement has been built off the back of critical acclaim. Now, the response to Pinotage it's never been more than mildly positive. And this is why I'm wanting to understand what you're saying. Like, do you think we can really build genuine enthusiasm and sustainable energy behind the grape if we aren't producing wines that are garnering international critical praise? Or am I just forgetting about the wines that do achieve that? Enlighten me.
Look, going back to wine competitions, I really believe that is one very important aspect of the conversation. But that is also built on the proactive mustering and lobbying of the producers. And I've been part of that. I've been part with clients of mine, Chardonnay clients, seeing how they've, over the past 20 years, worked towards building the category. Now, whether the success in the competitions has arisen out of the awareness of South African Chardonnay, and Jans is saying it's making the best Chardonnay outside of Burgundy, and this sort of thing, I do not know. But I really think that the platform that has been created by a category such as Chardonnay, and coming to the fore ever more is Cabernet Sauvignon. It's from ground upwards. It's from producers who really have a multi-layered enthusiasm and a great understanding and a tremendous ambition in getting your category and the dynamic elements of the category out there into the open. It's not something you can write a formula for or you can replicate. It comes from the effervescence of the soul and the vision. And I really think that what's happened in the competition sphere is, number one, because we have approached the international market with such a vibe about Chenin and Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, people take more notice of you. Producers become confident, they start making better wines, and they start winning more awards. So I don't think we can just see the awards as one layer of the success of a category like Chardonnay. It works, it's multidimensional. And some of these younger producers, smaller producers, Jono, they don't have the amounts of money to enter these competitions, which is a whack of amount of money, and they don't have marketing support to help them out. And so it's up to you and me to go and scratch them out and write about them and talk about them. It's up to the collective body to identify the various Pinotage jewels, talk, albeit region, style, approach, personality. And it's up to the association to elevate these unique elements of Pinotage, because at the end of the day, it's going to be to the greater good of the grape. Now, I know that Woza has highlighted Pinotage as one of the flag bearers of South Africa. The flag bearing game is like so old school, but I would definitely say that with the help of an organization like Woza and the resources they have, we can, I hate the word reimagine, but I'm going to have to say it, get like a new vibe going about Pinotage. It's a fascinating history, and I want to ask Tim Atkin and Andrew Jefford and Jancis Robin and Jane Supkling and Jamie Good, just stand back for a bit and think for yourself. A grape variety which hit the world 64 years ago and has reached this level of acclaim and recognition. Isn't it a wonderful story? And we need more recognition of that dynamic history and story to put us into the next level. And we must free the reins up to allow it to happen within the industry, among the producers and among the industry bodies.
You can't complete a conversation on Pinotage without discussing a little more about Beyers Trute. And what I want to understand is a story from that 1991 award. What did that mean on the ground? I mean, there must have been celebratory events and, international export contracts. And can you just give us a little bit of an idea? How did that actually play out? What were the changes? What happened to Beyers in that moment as a figure? I mean, was he always a big deal, or did that change things for him as well?
I think it changed things for Canoncorp and the South African wine industry. When Beyers started working there in Canoncorp in 1981, he never made a glass of wine in his life. He was working for a fruit, weather, climatology kind of thing. And as these things going in the industry, Jan Boland could see it resign from Canoncorp in 1980. They needed a new winemaker, and Beyers played a bit of rugby, and Johan Krieger, who you saw yesterday, his father, Jannie, was looking for a new winemaker, and he bumped into Beyers in a cafe, and they started talking, and next thing, Beyers had the job. And Beyers really started his whole winemaking career and inroads into wine at Canoncorp. But from the beginning, he told me there's something about Pinotage that just got into his soul. He blended the first Paul Sour in 1981. He loved the Cabernet and everything. But Pinotage, it was a different thing about it. It fermented quickly. But Beyers started doing the 2-hour extraction process in Canoncorp, which hadn't been done. He just became infatuated with the grape long before the award came. The award was massive news, because that was 91. We just come out of sanctions. South Africa was now for the first time getting its product into the world. And I remember it was like front page of the Afrikaans newspapers and the radio, and it was a big deal. I mean, those days, the mainstream media really took wine seriously. And the focus was on South Africa, of having this achievement. And Madame Lay de Marsan de Lalonde handing over this trophy, best winemaker in the world. And then secondly, he was for Canoncorp, and then, being Pinotage. I must look at my Sava stats that I have, but I think the plantings of Pinotage has increased enormously after Beyers' victory, and everybody saw it, well, Pinotage being recognized globally, so let's go for it. But it definitely was a great achievement in world terms.
And I suppose even Canoncorp, the unstoppable juggernaut that it is today, was in large part, it was launched by Pinotage, even though their Paul Sour is now an absolute global icon.
Well, possibly. They only started their first vintages in 1973. Yeah. But their first major international recognition was for Pinotage. And an award of that kind was much greater importance with respect than it is today. Today, all these awards are popping up all over the place. There's so many more countries making wine, so many producers. In those days, it was really a big deal. And it also cemented the fact that Beyers was for a long time South Africa's leading guide for Pinotage. And I think a lot of the machinations of how to handle the variety in the cellar derived from Beyers' guidelines. Now, as I said, it was pretty much a blank slate. Every cowboy was trying to make it his own kind of way. Beyers had these things about the skins and the fermentation process and wood and so forth. Take it or leave it, but those are guidelines for youngsters. And being the personality that he is, I mean, great mentors of people who went on to become truly Pinotage legends themselves.
But Beyers was never on about the chocolate and coffee Pinotage elements. So when did that pop up?
Yeah, that was quite a big deal. 21 years ago, popped up from Dimmersfontein. Bertus came, Bertus Fourie. He was working for Dimmersfontein in Wellington. And I don't know if he was using new barrels or staves or what. But, he entered the winery one morning. He just said to me that he just smelled this aroma of mocha. And they started making this coffee Pinotage, and it was popular. But it was a trend. KWV jumped on board and they've sold millions of bottles. Some of them are still doing it today. I don't see it being that popular. It was just a thing. But it was the fact that Pinotage had interacted with a specific wood to cause this mocha compound that a lot of red wines do have to be expanded. And it led to a lot of people beginning to drink red wine, A lot of untrained palates do find the odd bit of tannin aggressive, and this mocha didn't have it. And it was very popular. If you went to wine shows 20 years ago, the coffee Pinotage stands were people lining up with their glasses to have a sip and to buy a bottle and so forth. But I just immediately asked the question, why doesn't Cabernet Sauvignon do this or Shiraz do this? For some of the weird reason, variety Pinotage fermenting in that wood just led to this compound, this element coming out. And I think, Beyers quite rightly is old school. I mean, you don't put Coke with cognac and you don't wear socks with Crocs.
That's not old school. That's just common sense.
When it comes to Tage Meneer, you put it in French oak for a bunch of time and don't go off the other route, Purists, the purist take. I think that's what led to it.
Yeah.
I think the Michelangelo Awards even had a category for the best coffee Pinotage. Can you believe it?
That is wild.
But look, it's a gimmick. And today we're all talking about how to make more people take to wine. Personally, I don't want my wine to taste like anything else than wine. But if more people are cool with experimenting with vanilla Chardonnays and coffee Pinotages, and they get into the category and they find out more about grapes and wine, so be it.
Well, there's fascinating consumer studies that talk about how putting a flavor note on the label is key to controlling customer expectation. And if customer expectation is met, sometimes that alone is enough to turn that customer into a lifelong convert. So I think there's a lot of merit to at least the concept of the product. And I know that there's some local companies that are doing incredible things in the United States market with exactly that, a chocolate Pinotage or a chocoholic or a cappuccino Pinotage. You spoke at the beginning about not wanting to call it a Frankenstein grape, but I do feel like because it's almost like it's grown up, if we can get philosophical, sorry to do that, but it's grown up in such a turbulent time of South African wine history that in some senses, its identity has become quite fractured. And maybe that's what would have happened if you put a microscope over Pinot Noir 1,400 years ago and gone, what is Pinot Noir? Yeah. You might have an equally fractured idea of it. And I suppose you talked about Pinot Noir in the 30s and 40s. I know that in the 60s, at least, any good, in inverted commas, hearty Burgundy was only hearty because it had a nice wallop of Algerian Carignan or Algerian Shiraz in there. Just one last question, because we've been talking about Pinotage almost all along as a solo act. And of course, there is the category of Cape blends. And I call it a category, but I feel like I want to call it a non-category because it's kind of changed its rules. First, it demanded too much Pinotage. Then it demanded too little Pinotage. Then it couldn't decide what else you were allowed to have. And it feels like it hasn't really become anything. I think the current definition is so broad that it verges on being meaningless. So forget that Cape blend category. You could craft it now. What do you think would make a meaningful Cape blend definition?
I agree with you 100% on your take on the Cape blend, because I can never understand, if you blend 30% Pinotage with Shiraz and Mourvedre and Tannat, and you blend another wine 30% with Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, it's supposed to represent something, which is nonsense. John, I don't think we need a blend. We don't need another category to create expectations on a wine through blend or something. We even find it in the red wines today. I mean, MVM Raats is a great red wine. The Bordeaux blend second, a great red wine first. Mielis Rubicon is a great red wine. Rissenfreda is a Bordeaux blend with Shiraz in it, but it's just a great wine. So I don't really think we need a category with blends. I think Pinotage does enough on its own to warrant image and reputation of a fine grape variety. And if it does find it's part of a makeup of another wine, so be it, and let the winery make that part of its story.
Sure.
And I know you mentioned Pinotage and Pinot Noir and Cinsault as being a heritage thing. I know Bayers has done that, which is quite a nice wine, by
the
way.
trail dust.
But I don't need another category.
I think the only reason it may have merit as a category is simply because we've talked earlier about maybe Pinotage was objectionable because it was so different. And perhaps the idea of a Cape blend was to go, okay, well, let's tone down that crazy wild character of Pinotage, but still have Pinotage on the map. And I think possibly that was the idea behind it, going, how can we embrace Pinotage without being too Pinotagey? And I think that maybe that was the problem.
No, but one could say the same thing for Cabernet and Merlot. If you're doing Cabernet, should you also include a Bordeaux blend as part of your mix-up? I think it's too much categorization already. And if you want to make Pinotage and it's labeled as Pinotage, hey, you still got 15% of lacquer, elegant, ripe Shiraz to plonk into it, or a bit of muscle with Cabernet if needed. If it's a good wine and you make it part of your so-called house blend, which might be Cabernet Sauvignon, Shiraz, and Pinotage. Look at Petit Verdot, Malbec. They don't get much airtime on their own, but they're integral parts of blends. And if good Pinotage should just be seen as that and just be part of the foundations and building blocks of a good wine. I really don't need to try and add something else to the South African category. It's far too busy as it is. There's enough to talk about, and there's more than enough good wine.
So thank you for all your time. We're now
great stuff, John.
Well into the afternoon.
Go for the hour, we can watch your tennis start.
Well, I think I'd only keep you another hour if I could make you a cup of coffee.
Which you still owe me, by the way. Handmade, handcrafted.
Last thing, you mentioned things like having Bayers Truter as your mentor, and you also have some of the biggest producers in the country as clients of yours. When you are listening to conversations around Pinotage and the future of Pinotage, what are some of the things that you think are exciting about Pinotage in South Africa that listeners can either look forward to or look into further?
I would just say that for people who are really lovers and followers of fine wine and have experience, I think that they are really going to be surprised by the way that in the next 10 to 15 years, Pinotage stakes a claim in their fine wine reference. I think the image of Pinotage is slowly going to become more global. It's going to be known in the same terms of reference as a Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, and a Pinot Noir. And when you approach it on a blank slate, and the way the winemakers are improving the offering, understanding the grape, new Pinotage is being planted on new sites, you're really going to find Pinotage wines, which I think is up there with top Bordeaux. We make Chardonnay, which is top Burgundy. You're going to find a wine like Pinotage being deemed to be in the status of some of the great wines in the world. I think we have a way to go. I would say our top Pinotage haven't reached that status of reverence yet that you'll find in a great Cabernet or a great Chardonnay or a great Chenin. Not yet. But the way certain producers are approaching it, putting a lot of finance into their cellars, a lot of focus in the vineyards, and it's only been around for 64 years. There's still a couple of things to click into place in the next 10 to 15 years. And Pinotage is going to be known around the world as one of the great varieties, and is owned by South Africa, which makes South Africa part of the global fine wine conversation.
I think one of my most exciting experiences was tasting one of Kononkorp's, I think it was the 2013 or even 2012 Pinotage, and just tasting it at 12 or 13 years and realizing that it was, first of all, outstanding, and second of all, that it felt like it still had a long way to go at 12 or 13 years. And I think that question of fine wine, you can't avoid that without talking about ageability as well. So that's pretty exciting for me.
Yeah, I think definitely, perhaps that's what puts for a lot of people when they have younger Pinotages. I think Pinotage in his youth could be quite a feisty little character, but some of my favorite Pinotages, I just not just happened to bump into in older vintages. I mean, talking specific about Jacob's Dal, which is no longer making wine. I mean, if the Distell was selling out older vintages a couple of years back, and these are really, really astounding. So I just think the future is so bright, one has to wear shades.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to share this. I am already going to be looking for another excuse to get you to give up some time and talk more about South African wine history. But thank you again, Emile. And as I say, you can take me up on that offer to make you coffee anytime, and I'll pick your brain for more topics.
Only a pleasure.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the Vinimark channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.